Hey,
Hey,
calling
hey,
Chris Anderson in London.
this is Chris Henderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago. How are things?
I'm doing well in Chicago where it's about 50 degrees today.
Well, it's
So
balmy compared to
what am I
here.
doing in here?
I don't know.
I don't know. We'll wait for a moment for people to join us to get started. Welcome to History Happy Hour, everybody. And I do want to do shout out especially to the people who are watching us after the fact, right? The people who are not here right now, but
You
yet
want to
you
thank
are
them?
here. I want to say thank you. We
Okay.
appreciate you too. And we're here. I almost interrupted you.
No, go.
Okay, we're here talking about history every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages, and everything we do is archived on the History Happy Hour webpage on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours website. And Chris, we already have a huge number of people here.
Yeah, we do. And Marcus, you are first as always. So special shout out to Marcus, who always we know will be one of the first to tune in.
We see Doug McCord here and Lynn Hargrove and Joe Strauss, Kathy Hurst, Lizzie Borden, and the names are just going so fast.
I
I
know.
can't even see them all. Various people named Wally. I just need to say
Wally,
Wally, and
Wally,
that
Wally,
covers
Wally, Wally.
a bunch of people. Yeah, and a character in our show today as well. So, Chris, today is an anniversary.
It is.
76 years ago today. What do you think it might be? I know I can hear everyone's Googling. Everyone's Googling now, so don't reveal. Don't reveal, please. What do you think it could be an anniversary of 76 years ago today?
No idea.
Okay, I'll give you a clue. Visual clue?
Yes, please.
Okay.
The
Visual
Morgan
clue.
Bridge.
The bridge at Remagen.
So wow, you just pulled that out for wow.
Visited there a couple of years ago. So yeah, bridge at Remagen today. But Chris, there's another anniversary.
That I'm gonna
That
miss. Okay.
excuse me, I have to get my beer ready.
Okay. Uh,
8 years ago today.
you went on the wagon?
The Ghost Army documentary premiered 8 years ago today. So cheers to the Ghost Army.
Cheers.
Everybody wanted that in. And okay, have I wasted enough time, Christopher?
I think so, yes.
All right, so give me a drum roll.
Brrrr.
And the bell. Oh my God, I
You've
had the
right.
bell. I moved the bell.
So busy trying to dupe me with anniversaries, you
I
forgot
guess
the
it's, yeah, the
props.
bell. Boom, the
The
bell.
bar is open.
The bar is open. So the story we are exploring today in today's show begins with an armchair. And Chris, when I was a young journalist, I learned a piece of advice from an old journalist, because old journalists love to give advice.
Yep.
And he said, if you're going to write about a story about a bear, bring on the bear. You know, don't fiddle around, get to the bear. So I am starting by saying, here's the armchair in question, and it's a nice upholstered chair.
A very nice chair.
But rather than explain why this chair is the starting point of everything, I'm going to let our guest do that. And Daniel Lee is a senior lecturer of history at Queen Mary University of London. He's a specialist in the history of Jews in France and North Africa during World War II. He has a PhD from Oxford, and he is the author of The SS Officer's Armchair, Uncovering the Hidden Life of a Nazi. And I want to welcome Daniel Lee to our
Oh, good
program today.
Hi, Rick. Hi, Chris. What a lovely
Hello.
introduction. I love the musical entrance. It was
You like that?
wonderful.
Yeah.
Really,
Well-
that must have taken you some time.
There was that day that it happened. Yeah. It's all stolen from someplace else. Please don't tell anyone. Daniel, I want to say terrific book, intriguing story. And as you know, but the audience doesn't, I was shocked to find out that I have a bizarre personal connection with this story, which we'll
You
talk
do.
about at the end of the show. But for now, let's start with the chair. How did that chair start you on a historical journey?
Thanks. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on. And thanks, everybody, for coming. Lots of people from all over the United States and beyond I can see in the chat. So it's really nice to, in these days where we can't travel, to at least be in one place together. So to answer your question, I had recently moved to Italy. I was in Florence. And as you said in your introduction, I'm a historian of the Second World War. And one day I didn't read, maybe a few weeks into my time in Florence, when I didn't really know too many people, a few of us sort of got together and decided to organize an event. We were at the university there. And at this event, at my apartment, somebody sort of came up to me and she said to me, "Oh, you're that new historian of the Second World War. I've been looking for you because something has just happened to my mother. And I wanted to talk to you about it." And immediately that was very interesting to me because, of course, when you're a historian of the Second World War, and you guys know this, people always want to share their stories. They want to tell you, look, you're both nodding. People want to tell you about like grandfathers in the resistance or aunts who went into hiding or someone who rescued Jews or whatever. But this always happened 70, 80 years ago. Always. Things don't just happen to people's mothers. And so, she just proceeded to tell me how a few days earlier, her mother in Amsterdam had taken this old armchair, the one you just showed, to be reupholstered. It was falling apart, and she took it to the store and she left it there. And a couple of days later, when she went to collect the chair, the Dutch upholsterer who was doing all the work was really quite cross and angry. And he sort of said, "Well, what is this? I don't do work for Nazis or their families." And she was, totally, her face just dropped. And he just presented her with a bundle of documents that he had discovered sewn into the cushion of the armchair, all with Nazi-era swastikas and stamps, and everything belonged to one man called Robert Griesinger from Stuttgart. And the man doing the work on the armchair had obviously thought, "Oh, this is your dad or your uncle or your whatever. You're obviously somehow connected to this man." But this woman genuinely had no idea who Robert Griesinger was. And she had no clue how his documents ended up in her armchair. She hadn't inherited this armchair, which is what this upholsterer had presumed. Instead, she was a student in the 1960s and in Prague. She wasn't even Dutch. She was Czech. And in the 60s, like all of us when we were students, needed really cheap furniture in order to furnish her student digs. And so one day in the late 60s, she just sort of went around the old city of Prague, just buying tables, chairs, beds. I'm just looking around my apartment thinking, like, what else? Curtains. And she just bought this chair. She fell in love with the chair. And then in the early 80s, when some families were allowed to leave communist Czechoslovakia, she took the chair with her. She put it on the train, took it to Amsterdam, and she's had it ever since. So when you're looking at sort of family pictures from the 80s and 90s, this chair is always in the background. And so this woman at this party in Florence just sort of said, "Well, I really want to know, who is this man, Robert Griesinger? And how on earth did his documents end up in my armchair that's in my bedroom that I've sat on my entire life doing my homework? Please, can you figure this out for me?" So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question about the armchair.
So we'll find out more about Robert Griesinger in a moment and why this was worth pursuing. But one of the things that you discovered in investigating in Prague in this was that people there told you that upholsterers there told you that a lot of armchairs come in that like something like 1 in 10, was that the number, that have some kind of documents or photos or something?
What, are you kidding me? 1 in 10? No, it was sort of like 1 in 3. It was like, honestly, it was extraordinary because first I was so obsessed with this armchair. I wanted to write the story of the armchair itself. I thought that was the most interesting part of this story. And so I sort of, with the photo you just showed, I sort of printed out some enormous color photos of it and just walked around the old city of Prague, went to interview chair makers, upholsterers, antiques dealers. I wanted to know exactly who made this chair, how much had it cost, was it made in Prague, had it been, for example, had it ever belonged to a Jewish family? We know, for example, that in France and Belgium and the Netherlands, that tons of furniture was taken from Jewish families when they were deported, and the furniture was then shipped east often to furnish the homes of Nazis in newly conquered territories like the Protectorate, so Prague, or to furnish offices. So it was very common. And anyway, I just really wanted to know as much as I could about this one chair. And so there I was going in and out of all these shops in Prague, trying to find out everything I could. And people sort of were able to tell me more or less that it was made in Prague, and they told me it was made in the 30s, etc. But I do remember on a couple of occasions when I was really trying to get the information from chair makers, I would sort of, want to try and impress them a bit and catch their attention. So I would sort of say, well, inside of this chair, I found documents, Nazi documents. And I remember one guy was just like on his cigarette and he's like, sir, this was communist Czechoslovakia, for God's sake. I find hidden stuff every single day. Which is very interesting because it was so different, the reaction to the chairmaker in Amsterdam, who never finds stuff, who was genuinely, needed to sit down and have a tranquilizer after he discovered. Whereas in Prague, the reaction couldn't have been more different. He genuinely, people did hide stuff in all kinds of places.
Well, I will get to the character, but sticking on the chair for a second, given the reaction of the people in Amsterdam versus the people in Prague, do you think that there's just a different attitude about the war and the history in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, or is it?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think, there obviously is a different relationship to the Second World War, but I'm not sure how far the discovery of, the items of one Nazi might have.
Well, no, just that people in Eastern Europe are like, oh yeah, just another, bit of papers from a time, yet another really bad time.
Oh, I see.
Versus Western Europe, which is like, oh my God,
That's an interesting one. I just feel like with the chairmaker in Amsterdam, and it would have been the same in Prague, actually, but the war, it wasn't that long ago, let's face it. Amsterdam was occupied by the Nazis. It was just like in Prague, it was a brutal occupation. So, any sort of sign of resistance would have been put down at any point. So perhaps the chairmaker in Amsterdam might have had more of a personal connection. Right. He might have had an uncle or a father who was shot. So I think, it's always important to sort of know some of the context.
Right. Anyway, getting to the character, you say, and I'm going to quote here from the book, you wanted to see whether following the trajectory of an anonymous man could reveal anything new about the complexities of living under Nazi rule. So what is it that you discovered about the complexity?
Right, because this guy is a total nobody, as I make very clear at the start of the book. The guy, Robert Griesinger, born in Stuttgart. Oh, here we go. So here's one of the documents discovered inside the armchair. So it was. I think it's probably worth mentioning some of the documents because they were really, really important documents. These weren't sort of old bus tickets or anything like that. These were really identity papers, the kinds of papers you can't live without. They would have been the papers he would have kept in his pocket his entire life. So a couple of passports, including this one, stocks and shares that were never cashed, PhD certificate in law. So really deeply important things. But just from as soon as I got these documents in Florence and I was, wanted to know more about him, there was just nothing. You don't find anything about him online, nothing about him on any book, in any books on Nazi-occupied Prague. So, they're just, at first I was thinking to myself, okay, well, maybe he wasn't even a Nazi. Maybe he just worked for the party or something. But just going to Prague and going to the archives there. So within a few days, it was my interest in the armchair itself kind of suddenly dwindled when I got to the archives. And I found so much stuff about him from the National Archives in Prague and the police archives in Prague. That's where I saw, for example, he was in the SS. He was married. Like none of those. There was no sort of Nazi, nothing obviously Nazi about him from other than swastikas. But we have even Jewish families
right.
have swastikas all over ID papers.
So just to be clear though, so the papers in the chair then, they were just, there's no like diaries or it's official documentation of.
It was probably like the documents that he kept with him his entire life as proof of who he was. And so going off of these documents, that's what led me towards, now that I had a name and a date of birth, I was able to sort of obviously find out much more. And for so long, there's just all these books. We know that there are so many books on Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, all the H's, etc. And when we get beyond Hitler's inner circle, it's very hard for us sometimes to actually name other Nazis or know too much about them. So I was just thinking this might be an interesting opportunity to learn about one of Hitler's nameless or faceless followers.
Well, you say that he's not an ordinary German, but he was an ordinary Nazi, which
absolutely
I thought was an interesting. Sorry, Rick.
No, I it's kind of interesting because, as you've alluded to, if people are trying to understand why you wanted to pursue Robert Greisinger, he's a plodding student. He's an unremarkable bureaucrat. He's got a fairly typical married life. He's here with his parents and one of his children. He is pretty ordinary. But you said in the book, and you said this a couple of different ways, but you said in the book his very ordinariness made him more intriguing, and I guess that's because. What we always have to remember, and maybe you can sort of comment on this, is that the big name Nazis couldn't do what they did without 10,000 enablers, and
exactly.
that it's sort of interesting to then try to understand. And I think that's kind of the cool thing about the book, is try to understand the life of one of these enablers who probably thought of himself as just a good, loyal,
Absolutely.
upstanding citizen.
Oh, that's exactly what I'm trying to do in this book. Really just hone in on one person, one enabler. Just like forget the guys at the top. Like who was out there sort of allowing this to happen? Who was giving them their support? Who was enabling this, and why? And that's what I'm really interested in unpacking here.
So what was his trajectory then? I mean,
so he was, as we saw on the document, born in Stuttgart, 1906, and as so many of the people listening and watching tonight will know, this was a really, really critical time to be born. This decade between 1900 and 1910 that so many historians have looked at in depth when thinking about the Second World War, because that's where you find some of the almost all the leading Nazis, leading SS members being born between 1900 and 1910. The war youth generation, these young guys who are too young to fight in the First World War, but my God, just the First World War just totally marked their lives. Not just the war, but in the months and years that followed 1918, it just totally devastates them. Germany, nobody of his age or his class would have thought for a moment that Germany might lose the First World War. Germany wasn't invaded, it wasn't occupied. So for these young people, the end of the war in 1918, this defeat, this fear of communism, fear of Jews, Bolshevism, etc., it was all sort of too much for people of his class to handle. So that's really what sort of inspired him and many others to think about a new way to rebuild Germany, and that's what sort of drove him towards Nazism. But that's, that maybe we can talk about that in a few minutes, because it's not something that he was attracted to immediately. It really did take him a very, very long time to bet on the Nazi horse, so to speak. But he was somebody who came from a very, very good background in Stuttgart, Protestant background, upper middle class and military. His father was very high up in the military in the Kingdom of Württemberg, worked close to the king. And what's interesting here, I suppose, when talking about his father, because the money came from the mother's side, she came from timber. The father was actually born in New Orleans. His father had moved to Germany so after the Civil War and Reconstruction, when things weren't too good to be in cotton in New Orleans, he sort of looked to Germany and thought, oh gosh, look at Bismarck, look at the wonderful industrialization and economy there. I think let's maybe that's where we should sort of move to. So his family sort of up sticks, and they'd been in New Orleans since the 1720s, part of his family. So here's just one example of something I found in the family's archives. And this was actually sent at the beginning of the 20th century. So even though his father left New Orleans in the 1880s, they still continued to maintain a relationship with their American family, sending each other postcards and letters and all sorts of things. So this is that picture you just showed was a picture of the house which his cousins lived in New Orleans during the 20th century. That wouldn't have been. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry to jump in, but just to clarify for people, because we're talking about a number of different characters, and I think it's really quite striking. The man who's the SS officer at the heart of this story, Robert Griesinger, his father is born in the United States because his grandfather had gone to the United States to seek his fortune or whatever, and then decided, nah, it's not for me here. I'm going back to Germany, and reverse emigrated.
Right, and that's again something we often don't talk about as historians. We're also obsessed with thinking about, this journey from Europe to America, from Norway, from Italy, England, but we forget about those who came back. We forget about that a third of migrants thought, you know what, I don't like this America, I'm going back. So, and again, so this is. In terms of his family, so Griesinger, who I write about in my book, the SS officer, his grandfather was German, came to New Orleans, didn't speak English, but it didn't matter because half of New Orleans was German in the 1860s. So there was German cinema, German theater, German literature. He was able to get by without really speaking much English. But the person he married, Lena, had been in New Orleans since the 1720s. And when I was sort of in the archives in New Orleans, it was very interesting to sort of trace her family and see the numbers of people in her family who at one time or another had owned an enslaved person. And she was extremely close with her grandson. She lived with her grandson. She left New Orleans in the 1880s and settled in Stuttgart. Sorry.
No, I was amazed because there's just that picture of her in the book. And I just looked at that picture and I thought, God, what that woman has seen and how she must have been able to process her own history and her family's history from New Orleans and the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it's crazy.
Yeah, that's not what I was thinking. When I first started working on this Armchair, I never thought I would end up in an archive in New Orleans. Right. When it started raining, I remember the archivist blew a whistle and just sort of everybody had to pick up papers and put them on the top of. It was after Katrina, so I think everybody was very worried. But yeah, it was a great place to do research. Frightening.
Well, and it's I'm pushing the wrong buttons here. This happens to me sometimes. Where's the production staff when we need them? Huh? I'm a little upset. So you're telling the story of I guess we'd say a low to mid-level Nazi, and he rises as time goes by in the story, and he serves in various forms. And there's a couple of things that I thought were really interesting, and one is that he is a member of the SS.
Yeah.
But reading your book, and Chris is probably more knowledgeable about this than I am, so he may not have had this feeling. But reading your book made me feel like my understanding of the SS was incomplete, because I think of the SS kind of like you see it in the movies, right?
Right.
And it's either guys in black leather coats or it's guys in black uniforms, and they are a terror organization and they are Hitler's, paramilitary force. But it also seems that simultaneously, I mean, Greisinger's in the SS when he's a law professor. He's in the SS when he's a sergeant in the Wehrmacht. So it seems that it's simultaneously kind of like a men's club and political organization. Like, hey, join the SS, and
and he would have been he would have been very familiar with this kind of sort of male bonding, if you like, from his university days, because as I said, he was very right wing from his nationalist family. totally anti-Weimar, anti-Jewish, anti-communist, etc., who just wanted, was so humiliated by what had occurred in World War I that they wanted to try and rebuild Germany. So he went to the most right-wing university, Tübingen, to study law. And all he ever wanted to do was join one of the dueling fraternities. It was we even have a picture here of his dueling fraternity. And it was really, really important for him to be part of this club. And being a member of this club actually stood him in good stead for later when he was in the SS, and also later in Prague. There were a lot of connections I was finding between his university, his dueling association, and then some of the people we meet later on in the story. So he joins, I suppose it's worth mentioning that he comes very, very late to Nazism. He's not one of these people who we see in sort of the early, mid, or even late 1920s. He doesn't join the Nazi Party until 1937. Like, it's extremely late when we think about it. And the reason for that, one of the reasons is probably because he came from, as I said, he's from Stuttgart, he's from the Kingdom of Württemberg. And in this part of Germany, Nazism did not take off in the same way as it did in other parts of the country. When we look at the elections for Hitler in 1930, he did extremely well, obviously. I think the Nazis came second in 1930. But when you look at how many people in Württemberg were voting for him, not that many. It took much, much longer for the effects of the economic crisis to affect that part of Germany. This is not to say that Griesinger would in any way have been a liberal or anything like that. Far from it. From looking at his mother's diary, that was one of the most fantastic sources I had for this project. His mother kept a diary and wrote in it every single day. Okay, so here, for example, we have an extract of him as a little boy with his mum holding his little brother, when that's little Robert sort of clutching his mother's thigh. And so from her diary, we see sort of the politics of the family, we see who they voted for. And of course, it was one of these extreme right, monarchist, conservative parties. So, yes, there were no Nazis. There weren't that many Nazis in this part of Germany in the late 1920s, early 1930s. But what I'm trying to get at is that by the time the Nazis did take power in 1933, Griesinger had already been a member of these right-wing conservative nationalist clubs. It was very easy for him to think, oh, well, I'm not a Nazi now, but it's definitely something that I could see myself getting involved with. And that's something he did very quickly. And he did so, sorry, this is a very long, rounded way to answer your question. He did so by joining the SS. Because in early 1933, Hitler said, that's it, no more party membership. I'm sorry about that. We're not having any latecomers to this.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Did you know that, Chris? Because I didn't know that there was a 4-year moratorium on joining the Nazi Party.
Yeah, well, they had a lot of paperwork to catch up on.
It's like, sorry, we don't want any newcomers. But so he's looking for an alternate route in, basically.
Exactly, and his background, his pedigree, the fact that he's a lawyer, he has a PhD in law from one of the finest universities. It was very, very easy for him to sort of think, oh gosh, I've missed the membership boat, but look, I can still join the SS. And he knew so many people in the SS from his days at university that it was not too difficult for him to sort of get in that way. But once he was in, as you've already said, Rick, it's not as though he had to quickly put on his uniform every day, go out in the street and kill communists and Jews. He could just dip in.
That was just optional.
Right. He could dip in and out of membership as it suited him. That is something a lot of people, when reading my book, they've written to me about. They thought, oh my God, I thought being the SS meant, working in a concentration camp or working in one of the main ministries in Berlin. But no, like the SS in some ways was a club which you could, you would have to do the minimum, basically. You paid your membership fees. And you had to go every week or every other week to a 2-hour meeting with the other SS men. And you would sing, you would listen to speeches, you would do some sport. And often there were lots of events that involved bringing your wife, bringing your children. It was
it's important to help with the housework, I noticed. Yeah.
Well, it's important to be part of this SS family.
Wow, it
So it
sounds.
wasn't. It does. This is, the idea that everyone in the SS was treating it as a full-time job is completely not the case. The General SS, which was the largest SS, some people just they paid their membership fees. They went once or twice a month, and that was it. So it was really up to them. But you can tell that some people are being promoted very, very quickly. So obviously, if you're being promoted, then you're obviously doing something right. You're going to more meetings. You're taking it more seriously.
I don't know if this is getting too far off track, but you mentioned that of 80% of the SS that actually had degrees, they came from Leipzig, Munich, Göttingen, or Heidelberg universities. And so one of the things that I've always been interested in, and one of the things I've always found so shocking, is these are highly educated people.
Yeah,
They're not rabid, thug. These people are smart. They have PhDs and whatnot. How is it that the universities went so wrong? Right, the university is supposed to be the place where you can talk about ideas like this and say this is just nonsense.
Even in the 1920s, before we get anywhere near Nazism, sort of the early 1920s, just after the First World War, that's where we see some of the most extreme nationalist societies, if you like, forming. The most extreme anti-Semitic, the most extreme anti-communist. You just need to look for your local university, really, and that's where you're finding so many faculty members. Like, for example, Tübingen, which is where he went. They said, "Oh, you can't be a Jewish member of our dueling society," which was completely ridiculous because there were no Jews in the university, no students, no faculty. Right. It was just there were certain universities in Germany which everybody knew were extremely right-wing and totally against Weimar.
Well, and moving on from that, I guess a follow-on question is, after the war, you say that, a lot of these academics that survived the war just go back to teaching.
Oh, easy peasy.
You mentioned, I think you said 24 historians were barred from re-entering the faculty. But so do they have an effect on how people started to look at the Third Reich after it had happened?
It's really, really interesting. It took so long for people to really look at, for example, academics and especially historians. It was really hard to be a student and ask your PhD supervisor, "Oh, what did you do in the war?" You didn't want him or her to fail you. So I think it took a very long time for people in Germany to look at the universities and to really sort of go through and sort of work out who in the university administration was doing what, who was a member of the SS, who was the SD. So, for example, in the university where Griesinger was working in the late 1930s, that initiative has only been done in the last 5 years, which is ridiculous when we think about how late this is.
Well, and you wrote about that, and there were two things about that. One is that you said that they're going through the archive, looking to see, they're looking to see who did what, but the archive was also kind of edited a little bit before they started going through it.
Exactly. So after the war, of course, there's all sorts of weeding that happens. We know this happened all over Europe. Like in France, which is the country I know the best, it was sort of a top-down policy that from 1946-47, all documents that mentioned the word Jew were to be taken out of a public archive. And this is what happened. So from the late 40s, archivists were responsible for doing that. And we see similar things happening time and time again in Germany, where you have these organizations, universities or whatever, who are going through and rewriting their own history to make themselves seem as though they weren't complicit in what had occurred only 15, 20 years earlier.
Yeah. Wow. The other thing that was interesting is that you spoke to someone, and I apologize if in any way I'm conflating different things in your book, but I think I have it right, that at the same university there was someone who was trying to identify or find information on a certain number of faculty members or people involved with the university. And
Yeah.
she had, if it's a she, I think it was a she.
It was.
She had a whiteboard.
Yes.
And
Yes.
she had all the photos of the different people on there that she was trying. It was like one of those police procedural shows
Exactly.
where they're trying to solve the crime with the pictures up on the board. And I was wondering, to kind of transition a little bit to your own research procedures here, did you end up having a whiteboard like that? And did you, how did you figure out how to pursue this story? Does getting a PhD at Oxford mean they teach you all sorts of secret research techniques? Or did you have to, like the rest of us schlubs, did you have to figure it out on your own?
Exactly. It's funny you mentioned that whiteboard, and I can still see her office now. It was amazing. She was going through every single professor in the university and looking at them in the 1930s and what Nazi organization they belonged to. So she would have a picture of them, the SS, SD, or whatever, SA. And then we had lunch and we went over to a different part of the university. And then they had, these big fancy portraits up of the former university people. And it was exactly the same people. So in one room, they're being lauded, and in the other room, they're being taken to town.
Wow.
No, Oxford did not teach us anything like that. I think a lot of this was just rolling up sleeves and doing things the old-fashioned way. Like, for example, wanting to find out about Griesinger. I remember being so frustrated, having been all over the Czech Republic and archives in Germany, and just really being so frustrated by the silences in the archives and really wanting to know his voice and stuff more personal about him. I one day just picked up the phone book to Stuttgart and just called everybody in the phone book with the name Griesinger, because I couldn't think of any other way of finding his relatives or finding what had happened to him. So, and unfortunately, well, at first, of course, people thought I was crazy and I was trying to sell them something. But eventually somebody did say, oh yes, Robert Griesinger, I know him. He was my father's brother. Why are you interested? So a lot of this was just old fashioned, just, going after the source. So without doing that, I don't know how on earth I would have come across so many of the wonderful sources. All the photos you've kindly showed today are from the family. It took ages for me to build up this relationship with the family.
And you ended up talking to a couple of his daughters.
Yeah, so we have two daughters in this photo. So he got married to Gisela, we see here in the middle. They got married in 1936, just after the Winter Olympics in Germany. So in February 1936. Oh, here we see a photo of their wedding. So again, she came from a very good family from Hamburg, actually had spent time growing up in Guatemala because her family owned as I'm sure people here know, Guatemala is so famous for its coffee production in the late 19th century. A lot of the people who owned the biggest farms were actually German. And
so this is really just your typical Nazi SS Guatemala New Orleans story.
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
Happens all the time.
Yeah. One of those. Never. I don't even know why we're interested.
So she spoke lots of languages. Spent time, as I said, Guatemala. She spent time in England in the 1920s. She was actually divorced. She moved to Stuttgart in summer 1935 from Hamburg. She ran away from her husband, who'd been cheating on her, with her little boy, who was 2. And her sister lived in Stuttgart on a street called Schottstrasse. And it just so happened that Robert Griesinger was having an affair with her sister. They were lovers. And then one day when this beautiful woman shows up with her little boy, the story goes that he just totally fell in love with the sister.
There's a Loving Spoonful song about this, I recall. But yeah,
so
wow.
That's how their relationship started. And then what we see in the SS archives is the attempt that Robert did to try and make her his wife, because you couldn't just get married to a woman if you were in the SS. It wasn't as simple as going to the registry office or the church, because some SS still got married in churches, which is what happened to him. It was a whole hoo-ha. He had to get permission from Berlin. There were telegrams going backwards and forwards for months. There was genuinely, as we said at the beginning, there was so much paperwork. There was a backlog. You needed permission from Himmler. It took ages, basically. It took them about 6 months. And during this time, she had to prove that she would be a wonderful SS bride. So she went to the SS doctor. The SS doctor measured her hips, looked at her menstrual cycle. You know, you had to prove that you would be able to bear 4 healthy children pretty quickly. It was really...
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, right?
So
it made sense to them.
Yeah. Chris, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say I'm sure I cut Daniel off, but Lynn had asked
I'm
me,
sure you did.
what did Griesinger actually do in Prague? So
Oh, no. We definitely didn't even get anywhere near Prague.
I want to make sure I didn't cut.
That there are questions in the chat. I haven't been paying attention.
There's many questions and comments, but
Xavier talks
but
about Robert Paxton.
We do have a question about what he did in Prague. So he
Okay.
goes to Prague in 43.
He goes to Prague in 43 because he is so pissed that in summer 1939, he doesn't get a fancy posting. He goes from Stuttgart to what I suppose people know as the Maginot Line between France and Germany. And he's in the Wehrmacht. We have a photo of him, I think, Rick, of him in his Wehrmacht uniform. And he's really, really angry. And his letters from this time that I discovered really show how cross he is. He does not want to be in the Wehrmacht. So many of his friends from university have got these wonderful jobs all over Nazi-occupied Europe, in places like Prague and Warsaw and whatever. And he wants to be behind a desk. He's a lawyer with a PhD. He doesn't want to be, getting muddy. And which is what's happening. It's awful when you sort of read what's going on when he's invading Belgium and France and what have you. It's really with the horses, and there's a lot about horses in the diary. Anyway,
well, and he's like a officer in the SS, but he's a sergeant in the Wehrmacht. It's really hard to understand, I think, for some of us who aren't steeped in that.
It's because, quite simply, he wasn't as we keep getting back to, and you're right to keep reminding everyone about this. The SS was not his bread and butter. It wasn't his full-time job. If it was his full-time job, the situation would be different.
Right.
He was working in the 30s at the Gestapo in Stuttgart. He was a lawyer at the Gestapo. And then he kept on being a lawyer, but never permanently for the SS. So this meant that when war broke out, he was just like any other conscript. He had to put on a uniform, say goodbye to his family, his pregnant wife, who had a baby in December 1939. So he was able to get a few days leave to come back, see the baby in December 1939, and then go back to but nothing's even going on, as everybody knows. He's just sitting on this stupid frontier between France and Germany for 8 months, playing cards and doing nothing.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the war, stuff starts to happen. They move into France. They occupy France. He has this amazing summer of 1940 in France when France capitulates and the Germans sort of they divide the country up, etc. So he's having a very good time. Preparing for the Nazi invasion of Britain, which everybody knew was going to happen, Sea Lion, in July, August 1940. So they're doing him and his unit, they're just sort of, training in the River Loire for the landings that they're about to do in Britain. But of course, this doesn't happen. He goes back to Stuttgart. And then in June 1941, he's called up and he starts heading east. And again, part of the Wehrmacht. And as everybody here tonight will know, him and the other soldiers, they're just like scratching their heads. They're thinking, why are we going east? This makes no sense. We've got this wonderful pact with Stalin. Why could we possibly be going east? And from looking at the letters and diaries of this time, what we see is time and again, so many of these men are writing things like, oh, well, we must be going to fight the British in Palestine, or we must be going to British India, and Stalin's just going to let us through. They had no idea that they were about to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. It was such a surprise to so many of them. And so he's part of this invasion of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 41. He's headed east to through Ukraine. He actually comes across the village, when I write about this in the book, where my family came from before settling in London. And then he gets wounded, really badly wounded at the Battle of Kiev in September 1941. He goes back to Stuttgart. And then finally, he managed to make himself better, and he gets sent to Prague. So that's how he ends up in Prague.
There's so many questions that people have, and sadly, every week it seems like we wish we had a 2-hour show instead of a 1-hour show, but yet somehow we stay at 1 hour. But I do want to bring up a question that Frank Cook had here, because I think it's a terrific question, which is, what happened to the documents? Did the chair owner keep them? And also, does she still have the chair? So some inquiring minds want to know about the documents and the chair.
Can you put the chair picture up again? Because it's got this, of course, this is a beautiful new cushion.
This is the newly upholstered chair, right?
Of course, because, look how lovely that is. The old one, there's like bits coming across at the seams, etc.
Swastikas coming out. Yeah.
Right, it was falling apart. But no, this is definitely still in the apartment in Amsterdam. As I said, it's something that has been in the family since the late 1960s. They weren't going to part with that anytime soon. The papers that were discovered inside, they decided that they wanted Griesinger's children to have them. So I was able to introduce the owner of the chair to Griesinger's children, and they sort of just mailed them, in the normal mail. to one of his daughters, who today lives in Switzerland.
I think Chris and I probably have both had the experience of veterans from World War II mailing stuff that would strike you as absolutely priceless and not to be trusted to the U.S. mail. Of course, the European mail
Royal mail is different.
Yeah, but some of these people will put things in the mail and not even think about it. So pretty crazy.
Right. I had a heart attack when
I know. I've had several of those heart attacks. It's amazing I'm still alive.
So, Daniel, one of the questions I had now, a couple weeks ago, we had Philippe Sands on to talk about the rat line, and it's really difficult not to make comparisons between the two books. And one of the things that struck me was in the rat line, a lot of the people involved talk about what happened. They talk about the story. They talk about their fathers. Whereas in your book, you seem there's a lot more reticence on that part of people, the family, but also just the neighbors and the houses that you went to. It's difficult to get people to talk about this.
Yeah.
So I'd kind of like to get your thoughts about that. I'd also like to know, what do you think is the more common reaction? The reaction that you received or the reaction that Philippe received?
I mean, I was so lucky that I had this extraordinary story of documents hidden in an armchair that I could just say, hi, I've got these documents. They're your father's, clearly your father's. Mm-hmm. Could we have a chat? Without that way in, I don't see why anybody would ever want to talk to me or anybody inquiring about the past. I think post-war Germany would have been a really, really tricky place to grow up. I think, my goodness, when you think of those sort of the silences that just surrounded all these families in the 1950s and 60s, so many people trying to ask their parents questions about what they had done during the 30s and 40s and just not getting a satisfactory response. And these silences often just stayed inside these families for a very, very long time. And that's certainly the case with Griesinger's family, where it was just not at all discussed. They tried, his daughters tried and tried and tried. I mean, it's no spoiler for me to say here, I say it on the first page of the book, but Robert Griesinger died in Prague in 1945. I'm not giving anything away here. But for his daughters, who were sort of 8 and 5 at the time, it was something that was so tragic, so awful for them. And they tried to get questions. Their mother remarried very quickly after the war, so there were no sort of photos up of their father. It was very, very hard for them. And nobody just wanted to answer their questions. So really, until I sort of came along looking, 70 years later, they knew nothing whatsoever about their father. Because as I said at the start, there's no information about him online or in books. You have to go to these archives if you want to know precisely what people did. Although I did see a moment ago in the chat that somebody had asked about lists of SS, and that is quite possible. I think a lot of that is online now. Yeah. SS numbers, you can actually sort of trace people one by one.
I've just always been very interested in how, which is why I find your book so fascinating, is how the Germans deal with the legacy of the war, right? And how that's changed over the time.
I mean, as I said earlier, like the end of the war must have been crazy. Look, in 1945, there were 8 million party members, right. 8 million. And yet, when we look at Nuremberg, the trials, 24 senior Nazis put on trial. Right. And then, between 1945 and 58, there was something like 6,000 people put on trial when we know there were 8 million members.
So there's only 7,994,000, right?
So I think a lot of these people, there was this very sort of, this amnesia was setting in, as I've said, the secrets and just not wanting to foul in your nest, I suppose.
Well, you talked about 0 hour. It's like they reset the clock to after the war. And
yeah, the war had been terrible.
Everything before it didn't happen.
Well, and a lot of people thought that they were the victims because of how terrible life was in 1945. Once the Allied bombing, once people were on the streets, there was no food, there was sickness, there was just bombs flying. People really often, I think, in Germany felt that ordinary Germans had been the victim.
Yeah, well, you talk about it in the book, and I'd like to get your thoughts about your research assistant in Stuttgart saying, and you had mentioned that you had a relative that flew in the RAF and flew.
Yeah, my grandfather.
And she said, well, then, your relatives caused pain too. And I thought, wow, there's a lot to unpack there. But false equivalencies, kind of strike me there. I didn't know if you were kind of taken aback when that happened. Or...
Of course. No one's ever accused me of being a relative. You're so used to talking to children or grandchildren of Nazis and sort of, well, I am at least anyway, and they sort of sometimes apologize, or they're very sort of respectful, and many of the ones who I talk to at least, but no, I've never actually had sort of, the shoe has never been on the other foot before. So the fact that my grandfather was dropping bombs on Stuttgart in 1944, it was sort of a moment where, gosh, yeah, I have never expected, especially as a British Jew, who, as I wrote about in the book, so many of my family were also killed in Central and Eastern Europe during the war. So it really was I did have to step back and think about what that meant, that so many Germans had been affected by Allied bombings.
So here I was reading your book, and I get to page 149. And you write about the fact, and you mentioned it earlier in the interview, that Robert Griesinger buys essentially a condo, or he rents an apartment in this building that we see here, and it's on a street called Schatzstrasse in Stuttgart. And this fact totally rocked my world because, as it turns out, in 1961, when I was 5 years old.
Now everybody knows how old Rick is.
Yeah, you do the math. Okay, I lived on Schatzstrasse. And here's a picture that my sister Kathy Hurst supplied of the house we lived. It was about, 2/10 of a mile, 3/10 of a mile from the Griesingers. My father was a visiting professor in Germany at the time, and rented, somebody rented, I think, for him an apartment kind of unseen. It turned out that the landlady, Frau Zeitvogel, was operating a very interesting business out of one of the top floors involving young women that raised some eyebrows in the neighborhood. And this is that house today. This is what it looks like more recently. And just to point out, Schatzstrasse is not, Daniel, as you know, because I know you've been there. It's not Michigan Avenue in Chicago. It's not Pall Mall in London. It's a small, quiet little suburban Stuttgart street. And this is a picture from our house down the street. And I can't.
Come on, show the picture, Rick.
Yeah, I'm going for it.
There we go.
Yeah, there I am.
Little Rick.
There's little Rick from a viewpoint near that street. And as I told you, Daniel, my family, we engaged in a 2-day discussion because my sisters, Catherine and Margaret, are both have the research bug, and we were trying to figure out if that was the church that Griesinger got married in, but it turns out it's not. We haven't figured out quite what church it is, but it was really striking. And you had in your book you had, because I'm always a person who dives into the footnotes and looks at
Mm,
how did you find out information, and you had sourced information to street directories in
mhm.
Stuttgart that you obviously had looked through at some point. And it turns out that a bunch of those street directories are online now on Ancestry.com.
It's
So
fantastic.
I went back to 1961, found Frau Zeitvogel, who is there. But my sister also found Frau Zeitweigel, our landlady, as being there in 1940.
Wow. So they
So
could have
she
been
was there
neighbors.
through the whole war. She could have known the Griesingers,
Or
right?
maybe her husband was in the SS and maybe they went to the same meeting once or twice a week.
And meantime, there in 1961, also, sorry, Chris,
No, I'm telling.
but meantime, I also looked in the 1961 directory, and Wally Griesinger is in the
Yeah,
1961 phone directory in Stuttgart.
she died
Who
very late.
Robert? Yeah,
So Robert's mother, she was the only member of the family to go through any kind of denazification
but she
after.
was still there, so I could have, had I only known. My 5-year-old self could have marched over to her house and demanded to know about her Nazi SS son. And I'm not sure what kind of interviewer I would have been at the time, but to me it was it's easy to forget, even though we talk to veterans who were involved in fighting in World War II. It's easy to forget how close it is to us,
Yeah.
how much overlap there is, how these people, it is possible to connect with people who knew people.
Right. Although I would say that, and I think we've noticed this with COVID, the numbers of elderly people in their sort of 80s and 90s who in the last 2 years, have sadly died. I think that, we are getting to a point now where this kind of history isn't going to be possible to do in 20 years. I was able to do this history because the daughters and the nephew welcomed me into their homes, and they were able to, they knew they had the information at their fingertips that they'd kept up here. They knew who was who. They knew who was related to who and how, and they were able to show me the documents. They were able to take me to the attic and sort of say, oh, have a look at this, have a look at that. I just don't think that will be possible in 20 years. There won't be people left with memories. And I think a lot of people, in my experience, when they are clearing out an elderly relative's house, a lot of the papers just get thrown out. It's very, some of, as historians, it's sort of the biggest tragedy to see these diaries and letters just being put on a skip somewhere.
Well, Daniel, what you've done with his life is remarkable. I mean, I think it's safe to say that you've kind of brought him back from complete oblivion, because even his daughters didn't really know that much about him. So you've put together this life, and it's fascinating and it's illuminating. One of the things I'd just be curious to know is, are there things that you just weren't able to find out? Things that parts of the story that you're like, gee, I wonder what or if, or without giving anything away you don't want to give away, but
I mean, look, I think when you're working on one person for such a long time, I think there's always, you get to know your character a bit, I suppose, but there's so much more. I wish I wish I could talk to him. I wish we haven't had a chance. I know our time is nearly up, but we haven't had a chance to talk about the Holocaust, really, and his role in it, and the fact that he came so close to my relatives for a start in Ukraine. He was in the same shtetl that they were from, and all of their, none of these people were heard from again after the Second World War. But in particular, in Prague, where he was responsible for sending thousands and thousands of young Czech men and women to forced labor camps and to all kinds of work placements in Germany. Very, very dangerous conditions, grueling conditions. So I would really like to know a little bit more about how he saw his role, like from his own voice, of course. Yeah. But that's something that all historians, we can never...
Right. It's interesting because I've studied a lot of American Canadian veterans, so it's easier to talk to them about it, right? Because we're the good guys, and Rick has spent a lot of time with the Ghost Army, right? But it must be an odd thing to spend. You know more about this man than anybody else alive, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. That just must be a heavy thing to study this person who's an ordinary Nazi and to have.
Yeah, but that's, as we said at the start, that's, you know, what made it, you know, so fascinating.
Right.
And I think that's why, you know, in a few, you know, we have so much extreme politics today all over the world. We have places in every corner of the world embracing various kinds of extremism. And we see these leaders speaking in a language that for a lot of people just seems totally incomprehensible.
Right.
And I think the quest for future historians is going to not to be, you know, don't look at the leaders who are saying all this stuff. Let's look at the people who are enabling them. Like, who is allowing this kind of message, who is supporting it, and why? That, I think, is what's interesting for us.
Yeah.
Well, Daniel Lee, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. What a great hour it's been, and we really, really appreciate your sharing time with us. And I want to remind everybody that your book is called The SS Officer's Armchair, Uncovering the Hidden Life of a Nazi. And I do recommend it. I think in addition to being a great story, it's a great primer for people who want to do research as to the lengths you can go to try to track stuff down. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel. It was great.
It's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I'm sorry I didn't see all the comment, but if anybody had questions, then do feel free to write to me at my Queen Mary University address.
Okay, yeah,
All
we'll
right.
get that out to everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Chris, I want to, as we get ready to go here, I want to mention that next week we have, you talked about researching the lives of Canadians involved in World War II, and next week we have a book on, called, an author on, named Tim Cook.
Yes.
And his book is The Fight for History,
History.
75 Years of Forgetting, Remembering, and Remaking Canada's Second World War. Did you want to say a word or two about that?
I just, as you know, it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart.
Oh, I know.
I've been been a fan of Tim's work for quite some time, and I'm really looking forward to talking with probably one of the world's leading historians about the Canadians and the forgotten Allied army of World War II.
I'm looking forward to it as well. So that's something next week on History Happy Hour.
All right, folks. Stay safe, everybody.